You signed the papers, you got the keys. Somewhere in a drawer, you've got a deed with your name on it, and by every ordinary measure, the house is yours, and so is the yard around it. At least that's what almost everyone believes, because underneath that same patch of ground in a surprising number of American neighborhoods, the law tells a different story. The dirt beneath your foundation can legally belong to someone you've never met. And in some situations, that someone has the right to walk onto your property and start digging. To make sense of how that's even possible, we can't start with your closing paperwork. We have to start with a legal idea that's almost 1,000 years old. For centuries, English and then American law followed one sweeping principle. Whoever owned the soil owned everything above it, up to the heavens, and everything below it, down to the center of the earth. In the old phrasing, it meant your land ran all the way to heaven and all the way to hell. By an acre, and in theory, you owned an infinite column of space, stretching from the sky above your chimney to the molten core of the planet. For a long stretch of history, nobody had any reason to question it. Then flight arrived, and the top half of that idea fell apart fast. The breaking point came in the middle of the 1940s. A chicken farmer in North Carolina lived at the end of a runway that the military began using during the war. Heavy planes roared over his property, so low that the noise terrified his flock. More than 150 of his chickens panicked, flew into walls, and died. His farm became close to worthless, so he argued that the government had effectively taken his airspace, and with it, his land, without paying him a cent. The case climbed all the way to the Supreme Court in 1946, and the court handed down a ruling that quietly rewrote property ownership in America. Owning the land no longer meant owning the sky above it forever. The old heavens to hell doctrine, the justices said, had no place in the modern world. The open air became a public highway, free for aircraft to cross. The farmer kept the low airspace close to his rooftop, but the endless column above him was gone. The sky didn't lose all of its value, though. In dense cities, the empty air sitting over a shorter building turned into something you could actually sell. A developer who wanted to build higher could buy the unused air rights from a neighbor and stack them onto their own tower. So the upward column didn't simply vanish into public hands. Part of it got measured, priced, and traded like any other slice of real estate, while the rest became a highway for planes. And this is the detail almost everyone misses. While the whole country focused on who owned the sky, the more valuable half of that ancient doctrine, the downward half, was already being carved up piece by piece. That's where the real story lives. The ground beneath your house can be legally split away from the surface you walk on. Lawyers call the top part the surface estate and the part underneath the mineral estate. When those two get separated into different hands, the result is known as a split estate or a severed estate. You can own the surface completely while someone else owns everything valuable below it. This is far more common than it sounds. In energy-heavy states like Texas and Oklahoma, severed mineral rights are so ordinary that real estate professionals often assume the minerals have already been split off unless a document proves otherwise. In large parts of the country, owning the surface and owning what lies beneath it are simply two different things. So how did the ground under so many homes end up belonging to strangers? Usually one of two ways. Somewhere back in the chain of ownership, a previous owner either sold the minerals and kept the surface, or sold the surface and kept the minerals. Once that split happens, it can travel down through every future sale, often without the next buyer ever fully realizing it. The other source is the government itself, and this one shaped the entire American West. The country had handed out land before, and handed out all of it. Under the original homestead law passed during the Civil War, a settler who worked a claim long enough earned the whole thing, the surface and everything beneath it together, as one package. But by the early 1900s, the government had seen how much wealth was buried underground, and it quietly rewrote the deal. In 1916, Congress passed a law meant to help ranchers settle dry western land. It handed qualified settlers 640 acres each, a full square mile, for raising livestock. But the government had already learned the value of what sat underground, so it wrote in one crucial reservation. Settlers got the surface. The federal government kept all the coal and minerals underneath. That reservation seemed like a small clause at the time. It wasn't. Over 70 million acres of the West were privatized under that single law, with the minerals held back by the government. By 2006, the federal government administered the subsurface beneath roughly 58 million acres of land whose surface was owned privately or by a state. And much of that land, originally meant for grazing cattle, was later chopped up into subdivisions and sold as ordinary home lots. Which means a quiet suburban house today can sit on ground where the earth beneath it still belongs to the federal government. If you're finding this useful and you want more breakdowns of the strange fine print hiding inside everyday life, take a second to subscribe. It really helps the channel keep going. Now, let's get to the part that catches homeowners completely off guard. While most people pour their worry into a fence line or a boundary dispute with a neighbor, an entire body of law governs the space directly beneath their feet, and it doesn't always work in the homeowner's favor. Under American law, when the surface and the minerals are split, the mineral estate is treated as dominant. That single word carries enormous weight. It means the person or company that owns the minerals generally has the right to reach those minerals and develop them, even if the person who owns the surface would rather they didn't. The value locked underground is treated as more important than the lawn sitting on top of it. And it gets stranger, because in most places, the mineral owner is under no obligation to knock on your door and warn you first. There's no rule requiring them to tell a surface owner that the rights below have been severed. Plenty of families only discover the split the day a survey crew or a drilling company shows up expecting access. On the western lands governed by that 1916 law, the federal rules are blunt about it. The surface owner can't flatly refuse entry. At most, they can ask that the work happen at a more convenient time. Figuring out which layers you actually own is not always simple. The answer lives in the deed, in the title history, and in old records filed away at the county courthouse. And the split is rarely something a casual glance at a listing will ever reveal. Some families have owned a place for 2 or 3 generations without ever realizing the minerals underneath were sold off long before any of them were born. If you're wondering how that can possibly be legal, so is nearly everyone who first learns about it. For decades, a lot of these buried rights sat dormant and harmless because reaching the oil or gas underneath wasn't worth the trouble. Then modern drilling and fracturing techniques changed the math. Minerals that had been ignored for generations were suddenly worth chasing, and long-forgotten rights beneath quiet neighborhoods roared back to life. You can watch this exact conflict play out in the coal country of Kentucky. For generations, mining companies there held old severance papers known as broad-form deeds, documents that let them pull out the coal by whatever method they found convenient. State courts decided those deeds allowed full strip mining, even when it meant tearing apart the surface of land that families had worked for generations, and the people who owned that surface had almost no way to stop it. Bulldozers cut through hillsides while the families who lived on top could only stand and watch. It finally took a statewide vote in 1988 when more than 8 in 10 Kentucky voters backed a change to the state constitution to require a surface owner's consent before that kind of mining could move forward. The power of the mineral owner does have real limits, and this is where some balance returns. A mineral owner is generally required to support the surface above. If a company hollowed out so much coal that the ground caved in and a family's house collapsed into the pit, that crosses a legal line, and the surface owner's rights have been violated. The right to the minerals doesn't include the right to destroy the home on top of them. There are escape hatches too. Several states have passed laws that let severed minerals slide back to the surface owner under certain conditions. In one state, if nobody explores or produces from the minerals for 10 years, ownership of them returns to the person who owns the land above. These rules shift from state to state, so the picture is never uniform. And plenty of homeowners are perfectly safe because they hold what's called a unified estate, where the surface and everything below it still travel together as one. If that describes your deed, the ground under your house really is yours. And minerals aren't the only thing under your feet with a rulebook of its own. Water follows a separate and equally strange set of rules. In several states, the groundwater below your land is governed by something nicknamed the law of the biggest pump. A landowner is generally allowed to pump as much water as they can from beneath their own property, even when doing so drains the well or the shared aquifer under the land next door, and even when the neighbor is left with a dry tap. Texas courts settled that idea more than 100 years ago when a railroad sank a powerful well, pulled a neighbor's supply dry, and walked away without owing a thing. Surface water is stranger still. A creek running through your yard usually belongs to the state rather than to you, and you often need permission before you can put it to any serious use. But underneath even the mineral and the water question sits a deeper and stranger layer, and this is where the second story begins. Suppose you do own the surface and the minerals, the whole vertical stack, free and clear. Do you own that land the way a monarch owns a crown, answering to no one above you? The honest answer is no. True absolute ownership of land, the kind lawyers call allodial title, doesn't really exist for ordinary people in the United States. Almost every American home is held in what's called fee simple, which is the strongest form of private ownership the legal system offers. Even so, it sits underneath a set of powers the government never gave up. There are 4 of them. The government can tax your property. It can take your property for public use through eminent domain, as long as it pays you. It can regulate how you use your land through its police power, which is where zoning and building codes come from. And if you die with no heirs and no will, your property can pass to the state through a process called escheat. Every one of those powers sits above your title quietly, whether you ever think about them or not. Eminent domain alone has cleared the path for highways, reservoirs, and power lines, and it has flared into fierce public fights when governments moved to take ordinary homes and hand the land to private developers who promised jobs and tax revenue in return. Property taxes make the point sharper than anything else. If you stop paying them for long enough, the government can place a lien on the home you supposedly own outright and eventually sell it out from under you. That's not the behavior of a landlord you can afford to ignore. In the fullest sense, nobody in America holds land as a personal kingdom. What you hold is the strongest private claim the law recognizes, and that claim always rests beneath the authority of the state. You'd think all of this would be spelled out clearly the day you sign for a home. Almost nobody ever hears a word about it. The deed gets filed, the keys change hands, and the assumption that you own everything from the grass to the groundwater simply goes unchallenged. So the ground beneath your house is really a stack of separate legal layers, each one owned and governed a little differently than the last, and most of it invisible from the front porch. The surface can be yours, while the minerals belong to a stranger. Even a fully unified estate still answers to 4 powers you never sat down and negotiated with. The deeper question is how many other parties you'd have to answer to before you could ever call the ground truly and completely your own. Understanding that stack is the difference between a buyer who signs on faith and one who actually knows what sits beneath the foundation. Next time you walk your yard, it's worth remembering that the soil under your shoes carries a long history of deals, reservations, and government powers stretching back more than a century, almost all of it written down long before you ever arrived. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe. And if you'd like to continue watching more of my videos on legal nuances, you can click the video on the screen now.